My name is Clint Hicks. I am 74 years old and I have worked most of my life as a chemical engineer at Brookings Chemical. I always thought I was doing everything right, working honestly, saving money, loving my wife, raising my son. Now, sitting in an empty house with a cup of cold coffee, I realize I made a mistake somewhere. A mistake that led to my only son practically stopping talking to me. Every morning looks the same. I wake up at 6 sharp, even though I could sleep as long as I want. Time flows differently in retirement. I'm used to getting up early since the factory. I make breakfast for one, turn on the local news, though there's rarely anything interesting going on in Brookings. Sometimes I call old colleagues, but our conversations are getting shorter and shorter. They have grandchildren, summer homes, fishing trips with their sons. All I have is a house that's too big for one person. Mabel's picture sits on the mantelpiece. 15 years have passed since cancer took her. She was 57, too young. Sometimes I talk to her, tell her what happened during the day, even though there isn't much to tell. I ask her where I went wrong with Leroy, but the picture is silent. Our son has changed since his mother died. He was never particularly close to me. I worked a lot when he was a kid, often came home when he was already asleep. But at least we talked. Mabel was always the bridge between us. Without her, the bridge collapsed. "You could have saved her," he told me at the funeral. "If you'd gone to that clinic in Rochester sooner, if you'd spent more money on treatment." I remember the rain running down his face, mingling with his tears. We were both crushed with grief, but his words cut right through me. We were doing the best we could. Mabel didn't want experimental treatments. She wanted to spend the rest of her time at home with us. I respected her decision. Leroy never understood it. After the funeral, he moved across town. He called once a month, came to visit at Christmas, not every year. Our conversations became an exchange of platitudes. "How are you? Dash dash. Fine. Everything okay at work? Dash. Yeah. The weather's not bad today, dash. Uh-huh." Leroy never talked about his life. I only found out that he quit his job at the lab and took a job at a bookmaker's office when I happened to meet his former coworker at the supermarket. I only found out he'd broken up with the girl he'd been dating for 5 years when her mother called me to offer condolences. For some reason, she assumed I knew about the breakup. I tried to mend the relationship. I invited him to dinner, offered to help with repairs to his apartment, inquired about his life. His response was short and cold. "Busy. I'll manage on my own." "That's okay." Gradually, I stopped trying. In the last year, I've only seen him twice. The first time was at my neighbor Tom's birthday party, where Leroy only came because Tom was his godfather. The second was when I ran into him by chance at the drugstore. He looked tired and gaunt. But when I asked him if he was okay, he just mumbled, "Everything's fine, Dad," and hurried away. And then this Sunday morning, as I was weeding the garden that Mabel always loved so much, I heard the familiar sound of the engine of his old Ford. The car stopped in front of my house and I froze with the garden shears in my hands, not believing my eyes. Leroy never arrived unannounced. He got out of the car and I immediately knew something was wrong. My son had always taken care of himself, another trait inherited from his mother. Now his shirt was crumpled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were surrounded by dark circles, as if he hadn't slept in days. He looked around as if someone was watching him. "Leroy," I put the scissors down and moved toward him. "What's wrong?" "Hi, Dad." His voice sounded hoarse. "Can I come in?" Inside the house, he sat on the couch, the same one where Mabel and I liked to watch old movies in the evenings. He drummed his fingers nervously on his knee, refused tea or even water. "I'm in trouble, Dad," he said at last, looking down at the floor. I sat down across from him, feeling my insides clench. In 15 years, he'd never once asked for my help. Whatever had happened, it was serious. What had happened? He took a deep breath. "I owed money. A lot of money." "To the bank?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be different. He shook his head. "People you don't want to mess with." "Yeah. I used to gamble. First just sports betting, then cards. I thought I could get even, but..." He stopped talking, and I could see his hands shaking. My son, who had always seemed so confident, now looked like a frightened child. How many? I asked. 236,000, he answered so quietly I could barely hear. The figure stunned me. It was more than I'd made in the last 5 years at the plant. Jesus, Leroy, how could you? I know, Dad, I know. He jumped up off the couch and started pacing around the room. I screwed up, but now they're threatening me. Yesterday, 2 guys came after me after work, said if I didn't give them the money within a week, his voice broke. They'd break my arms for starters, and then it would get worse. I looked at my son and didn't recognize him. When had he gotten so messed up? How could I have missed it? Why don't you go to the police? He laughed bitterly. The police? Dad, these people aren't afraid of the police. Besides, I owe them by law. I signed the receipts. If I go to the police, I'll go to jail for illegal gambling, and they'll get nothing. Then what do you suggest? He stopped and looked at me. There was a mixture of shame and hope in his gaze. I know you have savings and a house. It must be worth a decent amount. If you sell it, you want me to sell the house I've lived in for almost 50 years? The house where your mom and I raised you? I have no other choice, Dad. His voice became hysterical. You don't understand who I'm dealing with. These aren't some petty crooks. These are serious people. They'll find a way to get their money. And if it's not from me, then... He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. The threat extended to me. Leroy, I tried to speak calmly. Let's think about it. Maybe there's another way out. Maybe we can negotiate an installment plan or... No, he shook his head. I already tried. They gave me a week, just a week. He sank down on the couch and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying. I hadn't seen Leroy cry since he was 16 and shattered his knee falling off his bike. I walked over and sat next to him, tentatively putting my hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away, and that was something. I blew it, Dad, he whispered. I thought I could control everything, that I could quit at any moment. But it's a drag. One win, and you think you can win again and again. And when you start losing, you convince yourself that your luck will come back. You just have to bet a little more. I looked at my son and saw him in a way I'd never seen him before. Vulnerable, broken, sincere. For the first time in 15 years, he spoke to me genuinely, without barriers or coldness. When did it start? I asked. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve, like he used to do when I was a kid. About a year after my mom died, I felt empty, alone. Then a coworker invited me to a poker club, just for fun, to get my mind off things. I won that night. Not much, but it was enough to feel something. Excitement, adrenaline. It was better than nothing. I knew what he was talking about. After Mabel died, I too looked for ways to fill the void. I immersed myself in work, then gardening, reading, anything to avoid thinking about her being gone. Why didn't you ever tell me? What would you have done? He asked bitterly. Would you have lectured me on how irresponsible I was? How I disappointed you and Mom? His words hit me like a slap in the face. Did he really think of me that way? As a cold, judgmental father? I would have listened to you, I said quietly. I would have tried to help. He looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to determine if I was telling the truth. Then he looked away. It's too late for that. All I want now is the money. Otherwise, he didn't finish, but his hand touched his face involuntarily, as if he could feel the blows he was about to receive. I got up and went to the window. Behind it was the orchard that Mabel loved so much, the apple trees we had planted when Leroy was first born, the rose bush I had carefully sheltered every winter, the house where every corner held memories of our lives, and my son, who came to me for the first time in years. Even if it was for problems, even if it was for money, but he came. Maybe it was a chance to mend what was broken 15 years ago. I'll think about what I can do, I said without turning around. But I need to know all the details. Who exactly you owe, how to contact them, what the terms are. I heard him exhale in relief. Thanks, Dad. I'll tell you everything. When I turned to him, he had an expression on his face that I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. And I'd promised him I'd build him a treehouse, a mixture of hope and trust. But on one condition, I added, no more gambling, no more betting, no more poker. You'll get help. Professional help. He nodded too quickly and too easily, and somewhere in the back of my mind I felt anxious. But I pushed it away. I wanted to believe that my son really wanted to change, that this trouble could be the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. I promise, he said. I swear on my mom. The mention of Mabel made me wince. He rarely talked about her after the funeral. Okay, I said. Then tell me everything from the beginning. And he started talking. About the underground casinos in Brookings that I didn't even know about the people who gave him loans at huge interest rates, about how he was trying to get even and only got deeper in debt. He talked and I listened, feeling my resolve to help him grow stronger with each word. I didn't know where this decision would lead. I didn't know that I was sitting across from a man who would betray me in the cruelest of ways. All I saw was my son finally opening up to me, and I was willing to do anything to save him. In the morning, I woke up long before dawn. Leroy had stayed the night in his old room, which I had kept virtually untouched since he had moved out. I could hear his restless sleep, the creaking of the bed, the mumbling, the sudden sighs. My son was frightened, and it was forcing me to act. I went down to the kitchen and made coffee. It was a habit left over from Mabel. She always said you couldn't make serious decisions without a strong cup of coffee. It was starting to lighten outside the window, and I watched the first rays of sunlight touch the tops of the trees in the garden. Perhaps the last dawn I would see from this window. The decision had come to me during the night. I had 3 days to raise $236,000. Retirement savings totaled about $190,000, the result of 40 years of savings and careful investments. The only way to get the rest of the money was to sell the house where I'd lived most of my adult life. I clenched my coffee cup so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just a house. It was the world Mabel and I had created for ourselves and for Leroy. Here on the kitchen wall, there were still markings of our son's height, from 3 to 16 years old. Here in the living room was the piano that Mabel sometimes played in the evenings. Here in the backyard is where I built a treehouse for Leroy when he was 8. This is where Mabel died, in our upstairs bedroom, holding my hand and looking out the window at the apple trees she loved so much. Selling the house meant parting not only with the walls and roof, but with those memories. With the feeling that Mabel was still here, in a way, in the flowers she'd planted, in the curtains she'd picked out, in the creaking floorboards at the bathroom entrance that I'd never fixed because she'd gotten used to the sound. But what was the alternative? To say no to Leroy? Let these people he owed cripple him, or worse? And most importantly, miss perhaps the last chance to repair our relationship? I heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up. Leroy was standing in the kitchen doorway, still in the clothes he'd arrived in yesterday. He looked awful pale, red-eyed, and trembling. "Morning," he said hoarsely. "Coffee," I offered. He nodded and sank into a chair by the kitchen table. It was the table where the three of us used to eat breakfast every morning. Mabel made pancakes on Sundays, and Leroy always asked for more. I put the cup in front of him and sat down across from him. "I've decided," I said. "I'll help you pay off your debt." The look of relief on his face was almost physically palpable. "Thanks, Dad. Yay? I'll pay you back, I swear, as soon as I get back on my feet." I nodded even though I didn't believe it. Leroy had never been particularly reliable with money. As a teenager, he borrowed constantly and rarely gave back. But it wasn't about money. Money was just a means to an end. "I'll call the realtor today," I said, "and to the bank to withdraw my retirement savings. The paperwork on the house would take a few days, but I could get a down payment." "Would that be enough to buy us some time?" Leroy thought for a moment. "I think so. If you show them the process is underway and give them a portion of the amount, they can wait." "That's good. Then we need to make a list of all the creditors and the exact amounts. I want to know who I'm dealing with." He nodded and started digging through his jacket pockets, pulling out a crumpled envelope. "It's all here. Names, amounts, contacts." "Yeah?" "I drew it up yesterday, before I came to see you." I took the envelope, but didn't open it. There was something else I had to say, and I didn't want to put it off. "There is one condition, Leroy. You'll move to another realtor, a different neighborhood. You'll start with a clean slate, away from these people and the temptation to get back in the game." He looked up from his coffee. "What about you?" "I'll move too. To your place for a while. Then I'll find something nearby. He was silent, staring into the coffee as if the answers to everything were written there. You don't have to do that, he said finally. You can just give me the money and I'll leave. You won't have to sell the house. There was something in his voice that I couldn't understand. Was it a reluctance to have me around? Or maybe shame for dragging me into his problems? I want this, I said firmly. Not just for you, for me too. There are too many ghosts in this house. He nodded without looking at me, and in that moment I felt like there was still a huge gulf between us. But I was ready to try to bridge it. In the days that followed, I acted with an energy I didn't expect from myself. I met with realtors, bank tellers, potential buyers. I sorted through my belongings, deciding what to take with me and what to leave behind. To my surprise, the house quickly found a buyer, a young couple with a young child and another on the way. They fell in love with the garden and the spacious kitchen. The husband worked as an engineer at the same company where I once worked, and that seemed like a good sign. The house would live on, filled with new voices and new stories. Leroy came over a few times during this time, ostensibly to help with packing, but mostly just sitting on the couch, staring into his phone, and occasionally stepping out onto the porch to smoke nervously. I could see him flinch every time an unfamiliar car drove down the street. He was truly afraid, and that strengthened my resolve. On the fourth day, I withdrew the money from my account and got a down payment on the house. Leroy called his creditors and arranged to meet that same evening. I insisted on going with him. That's not a good idea, Dad, he said as we got into his car. These people, they don't like witnesses. I'm not a witness, I replied calmly. I'm the one paying their money, and I want to make sure it's done right. He didn't argue, but I could see how nervously he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as he drove. The meeting took place in the back room of a bar on the edge of town, a place I didn't even know existed, despite having lived in Brookings all my life. We were met by two men, one tall and thin, with long pianist's fingers and a cold stare, the other squat and muscular, with a scar across his eyebrow. They didn't give their names, and I didn't ask. I put the envelope of money and the papers proving the sale of the house on the table. Here's $150,000 in cash and the deposit papers for $50,000, I said. The rest would be in a week when the deal was finalized. The tall man counted the money, looked over the documents, and nodded to his companion. All right, he said, looking at Leroy. We'll give you a week's grace period. But if the rest of the money is not paid on time... He didn't finish the sentence, but the look in his eyes spoke for itself. It will be paid, I said firmly. The tall man looked back at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like respect in his eyes. You're a good father, Mr. Hicks, he said. It's a shame your son doesn't appreciate it. The word stabbed me in the heart, but I didn't show it. We finished our business and left the bar. The night air was cool and clean after the musty atmosphere inside. Leroy was silent the whole way back. It wasn't until we pulled up to the house that he finally spoke. Thanks, Dad. You don't know what this means to me. I looked at him in the dim light of the street lamp and suddenly remembered him as a 5-year-old boy, thanking me for a new bicycle for Christmas. The same tilt of his head, the same intonation. Suddenly a wave of love and sadness washed over me. I can imagine, I replied quietly. I only hope that this really is a fresh start for you, for both of us. He nodded but said nothing, and we walked into the house that would no longer be mine in a few days. I spent the next week immersed in the hassle of selling the house and packing. Every item I picked up brought back memories. Photo albums, old letters, souvenirs from the rare trips Mabel and I could afford. Where to put them, what to take with me into my new life, and what to leave behind. The day was especially hard when I sorted through Mabel's things that I had saved after her death. Her clothes still held the faint scent of her perfume. Her jewelry, simple and elegant, like herself. Her notebooks with neat handwriting, to-do lists, recipes, random thoughts. In one of them, I found an entry dated a few months before her death. Clint and Leroy were arguing again today. Why can't they see how alike they are? Both are stubborn, both hide their feelings, both long for each other's approval, but don't know how to seek it. I'm afraid that when I'm gone, they'll drift apart. Who will build bridges between them then? I sat on the bedroom floor, holding that book in my hands, and cried as I hadn't cried since the funeral. Mabel knew. She saw it coming, and there was nothing she could do about it. and I couldn't be the bridge builder she wanted me to be. Until the very last day, I had hoped that Leroy would come to help with the final preparations, but he sent only a short message. Very busy with the new apartment. I'll be expecting you tomorrow night. I rented a truck and hired 2 guys from the neighborhood to help with the move. I sold most of the furniture along with the house, leaving only a few items I couldn't part with. Mabel's rocking chair, the bookcase we'd bought the first year of our marriage, and an old oak chest that had belonged to my father. The rest of the stuff fit into a few boxes. One last look at the empty house was like saying goodbye to a friend. I walked around all the rooms, touching the walls with the palm of my hand as if wanting to keep their texture in my memory. Lingered in the bedroom where Mabel had spent her last days, stood in the kitchen where the 3 of us had had breakfast so many times. I went out into the garden and picked an apple from the tree planted the year Leroy was born. Goodbye, I whispered, not so much to the house as to the memories that lived in it. Thank you for everything. Leroy's apartment was in a new apartment complex on the other side of town. The neighborhood was considered prestigious. Glass facades, underground parking, 24-hour security. I knew my son couldn't afford such a place on a bookie's salary, and it made me wonder how deeply involved he had been in the world of gambling before things went south. The day of the final reckoning came. A week after I moved in with Leroy, the bank transferred the rest of the money from the sale of the house. Leroy insisted that we withdraw the entire amount in cash, almost $40,000. I didn't argue, though the thought of carrying that much cash made me uneasy. It's necessary, Leroy explained as we left the bank with the money in a plain paper bag. These people don't trust wire transfers, cash only. I nodded, though an inner voice whispered that it was strange. What did I know about underground gambling houses and their rules? It was a foreign world to me. We drove to the meeting with Leroy's creditors. This time it wasn't in the back room of a bar, but in some warehouse on the outskirts of Brookings. The place looked abandoned. Peeling paint on the walls, dusty windows, empty parking lot. The only car other than ours was a black SUV with no license plates. Are you sure this is the place? I asked when we parked. Leroy nodded, but his hands gripping the steering wheel were visibly shaking. Yes, this is Noah's place. He's in charge. It was the first time I'd heard the name of one of Leroy's creditors, and it calmed me down a little. At least now it wasn't just nameless threats, but a specific person. We got out of the car and headed toward the rusty metal door of the warehouse. Leroy knocked 3 times, a pause, 2 more times. Clearly a conditional signal. The door was opened by the same tall, thin man I'd seen at the bar. His cold eyes slid over us, lingering on the package in my hands. Come on in, he said briefly, stepping aside. Inside, the warehouse was surprisingly organized. There was a table and a few chairs in the center of a large empty space, brightly lit by a hanging lamp. In the shadows against the walls, I could make out the silhouettes of several other people, but I couldn't make out their faces. At the table sat a middle-aged man with close-cropped gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed impeccably in an expensive suit, an off-white shirt, and a muted blue tie. He looked more like a successful businessman than an underground bookmaker. Mr. Hicks, he said, addressing me without standing up. At last we meet in person. Noah Tate. I nodded, not knowing what to say. This man knew my name, though I'd never introduced myself. Please have a seat. He pointed to the chairs across from me. Did you bring the rest of the money? I placed the package on the table and sat down. Leroy lowered himself into the chair next to me without raising his eyes. $36,450, I said. That's how much was left to pay, according to the list Leroy had given me. Noah Tate smiled, but the smile didn't touch his eyes. That's right. I'm impressed with your punctuality and dedication to your family. There was a subtle note of sarcasm in his voice that I didn't like, but I didn't let it show. Noah opened the bag and began counting the money. His long fingers moved with surprising dexterity through the bills. That's right, he said at last when he had finished counting. Well, congratulations, Leroy. You're debt-free, at least free of debt to us. He laughed at his own joke, and a few of the men against the walls laughed too. Leroy smiled nervously. Thank you, Noah. Yeah, I appreciate your patience. Oh, I'm not the one you should be thanking. Noah nodded in my direction. Your father is the hero of the day. Not every parent is willing to give up their life savings to get an ungrateful son out of trouble. Leroy fidgeted in his chair. It was the first time I'd seen him really embarrassed in a long time. Okay, Noah said, standing up. That's the end of our business. I hope I don't see you again, Leroy. At least not under these circumstances. He extended his hand first to Leroy, then to me. His handshake was firm and dry. Dash, Mr. Hicks, he said, not releasing my hand. May I give you some advice? I nodded, surprised by his sudden seriousness. Don't trust people who have already betrayed your trust once, especially if they are your loved ones. He let go of my hand and turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. Leroy and I left the warehouse and got into the car. Leroy started the engine but didn't move, staring straight ahead. What did he mean by that? I asked. Nothing, Leroy answered quickly. Noah just likes to dramatize things. Don't mind him. He pulled onto the road and we headed back into town. Leroy turned on the radio, clearly not wanting to continue the conversation. I stared out the window at the passing scenery and thought about Noah Tate's words. They sounded like a warning, though I didn't understand what he was trying to warn me about. Back at Leroy's apartment, I felt strangely relieved. The debt was paid, the threat was over. Now we could start building a new life. At least I hoped so. Leroy, however, did not share my optimism. As soon as we entered the apartment, he headed straight to his room, tossing over his shoulder. I need to make some calls. The door to his room slammed shut, and I was left alone in the living room, not knowing what to do. In the week I'd spent here, I still hadn't felt at home. This was Leroy's territory, where I was merely a guest. I decided to cook dinner to celebrate the repayment of my debt. Something special, something festive. I found a recipe online for Leroy's favorite dish from his childhood, the roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon that Mabel used to make for special occasions. Went grocery shopping and spent the entire evening in the kitchen trying to make sure everything was perfect. By 8 p.m., everything was ready. Chicken, baked potatoes, green salad, even the bottle of wine I'd bought on the way back from the store. I knocked on the door of Leroy's room. Dinner is ready, I said. Not hungry, he answered from behind the door. Eat without me. I stood in the hallway, not knowing what to do. Suddenly the door opened and Leroy came out, dressed like he was going out. A new shirt, jeans, and a leather jacket I hadn't seen before. I'm leaving, he said without looking at me. Don't wait up. But I made dinner, I said, confused. Your favorite rosemary chicken. Leroy looked past me to the set table in the living room. I'm sorry, I have a meeting. An important one. Can't cancel. With who? I asked before I could think. His face instantly tensed. It's none of your business. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I'm just worried. Don't be, he said sharply. I'm a big boy, and I can handle my own business. With those words, he walked past me toward the exit. I heard the front door close, and I was alone with my dinner getting cold and feeling like something wasn't going the way I'd planned. I ate some chicken and salad, but there was no appetite. I drank almost all of the wine, sitting alone by the window and looking out at the city at night. Somewhere out there was my son, meeting with someone, discussing something, and I didn't even know with whom or about what. Leroy came back well past midnight. I was already in bed, but I didn't sleep. When I heard the front door open, I tensed, listening. From the sounds, Leroy wasn't alone. A woman's laughter, a whisper, the jingle of keys falling to the floor. Laughter again. Then the door of Leroy's room closed, and there was silence. In the morning, I awoke earlier than usual, exhausted from a sleepless night and a vague restlessness. I went into the kitchen and saw an unfamiliar young woman pouring herself coffee. She was wearing a Leroy shirt that was too big for her and didn't seem at all embarrassed to see me. Good morning, she said, smiling. You must be Leroy's father. I'm Audrey. Clint, I answered automatically. Good morning. Would you like some coffee? She offered, pointing to the coffee maker. I nodded, watching her move freely around the kitchen, as if she'd been here many times. She was pretty, with short blonde hair and bright makeup, even in the morning. Probably about 10 years younger than Leroy. Had you recently moved in? She asked, handing me a cup. A week ago, I answered. And you? How long have you known Leroy? Oh, a few months, she said casually. We met at the Scarlet Sales. It's a club. I nodded, though I'd never heard of such a club in Brookings. Is Leroy still asleep? I asked, sipping my coffee. Uh-huh, she smiled. Tired after last night. There was something in her smile that made me feel uncomfortable. I quickly finished my coffee and went back to my room, deciding to wait for her to leave. About an hour later, I heard the front door slam. I walked out and found Leroy in the kitchen making himself breakfast. He looked surprisingly alert and content. Good morning, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Ah, hi, he nodded without turning around. Is there any more coffee? Yes, your guest made it. Audrey, he said. She's nice, isn't she? Very, I agreed. Have you two been together long? Leroy laughed. We're not together. We have fun sometimes. I stayed silent, not knowing what to say. Mabel was always the one doing the talking, not me. Look, Leroy said, suddenly serious. We need to talk. He sat down at the table with a plate of scrambled eggs and a mug of coffee. I sat across from him, feeling my heart start to beat faster. About what? About your being here. He sipped his coffee, avoiding my gaze. I guess this wasn't such a good idea. I froze, not believing my ears. What do you mean? Look, Dad, Leroy sighed. I appreciate what you've done for me. I really do. But, I'm used to living alone. I have my own life, my own friends, my own, habits. I try not to get in the way, I said quietly. It's not that, he shook his head irritably. It's just, we shouldn't live together. It's not working. We agreed that I'd stay here for a while until I found a place to live. I reminded him. It's only been a week. I know, but he ran his hand through his hair. Look, we both know it was a mistake. You sold the house to help me, and I'm grateful. But let's be honest. We've never been close, and we're not likely to be. Every word he said was like a punch. I tried to stay calm, but everything inside was clenching with pain. I thought this was a chance to mend things, I said. Leroy snorted. Really? Did you really think we'd suddenly become the perfect family just because you paid my debts? He shook his head. It doesn't work that way, Dad. 15 years aren't going to disappear just because you made a grand gesture. 15 years, I repeated. You mean the time after your mother died? Yes, he narrowed his eyes. When you let her die. It wasn't fair, and he knew it. Mabel and I had made the decision together not to torture her with experimental treatments, when the doctors said the chances were minimal. She wanted to spend the rest of her time at home with us, not in a hospital room with machines and tubes. You know it was her decision, I said quietly. It was mine too. We didn't want her to suffer anymore. Yeah, I've heard that story 1,000 times, Leroy said. Cherry, look, I don't want to argue about it again. It's just, you need to find another place. Soon. He got up from the table, leaving the uneaten scrambled eggs behind. I looked up at him, not recognizing the man I'd raised. Is this about your girlfriend? I asked. Audrey? For God's sake, Leroy rolled his eyes. She's not my girlfriend. And no, it's not about her. It's because of me. Because of you. Because we've never gotten along, and we never will. I'm still your father, I said, feeling my voice shake. So? He shrugged. It's just a biological fact. It doesn't obligate us to be friends or even get along with each other. Look, his voice became softer, almost sympathetic. You did your part. You helped me when I needed help. Now you can go your way and I can go mine. It's better for both of us. With those words, he left the kitchen, leaving me sitting at the table, feeling like the ground had gone out from under my feet. I spent the rest of the day in my room, trying to figure out what had happened and what to do next. The sale of the house was finalized and the money was spent. I had some cash and a small pension left. Not enough to buy a new house, but enough to rent a modest apartment or room. It wasn't the money that was the issue, but the fact that I felt betrayed and used. Leroy left for the day without saying where. He returned late in the evening when I was already lying in bed trying to sleep. I could hear him walking around the apartment, moving things around, talking on the phone in a muffled voice. Then everything went quiet, and I finally fell asleep. In the morning, I was awakened by a knock on the door. Leroy was standing on the doorstep of my room, fully dressed, coffee in hand. "We need to talk," he said. I sat up on the bed, rubbing my eyes. "About what?" "I found a place for you to stay," he said, holding out a piece of paper to me. "It's the address of an old people's home on the other side of town. Nice place. Inexpensive. They have rooms available." I took the piece of paper, not believing my ears. "You want to send me to a nursing home?" "It's not a nursing home," Leroy said impatiently. "It's a boarding house. You'll live on your own, just surrounded by people your own age. It has everything you need. A dining room, a medical center, even a swimming pool." "I'm not going to a boarding house," I said firmly, handing him back the sheet. "I'll find my own apartment." "Suit yourself," Leroy shrugged. "But you still have to move out. Tonight." "Tonight?" I was stunned. "Why the rush?" "Because I've decided to." He crossed his arms over his chest. "This is my apartment, and I decide who lives in it." I got out of bed slowly, feeling every year of my age in my joints and spine. "Do you want me to leave tonight? After everything I've done for you?" "Oh, here we go." Leroy rolled his eyes. "After everything I've done for you?" "Yes, I know you sold your house to pay my debts. And I'm grateful. I really am. But that doesn't give you the right to live here forever or tell me how to live my life." "I never told you how to live," I said quietly. "Don't start." He held up his hand, stopping me. "Look, I don't want to fight. Just pack your things and leave. Do you want me to call you a cab?" I looked at him and didn't recognize him. This was not the frightened boy who had come to me a week ago, begging for help. This was a completely different man, cold, calculating, ruthless. "You used me," I said, finally realizing the truth. "All you wanted was my money." Leroy smiled, and there was nothing of my son in that smile. "Well, you've done a big favor for me. Now get lost," he said with icy calm. "I have my own plans for this apartment, and you are not part of them." I stood there stunned by his words. It wasn't even betrayal. It was something much worse. It was as if a mask had fallen, and I saw my son's true face for the first time. "I'll give you an hour," Leroy said, looking at his watch. "Then I'll call a cab. If you're not here when he arrives, I'll just put your stuff out in the hallway." He walked out, leaving me alone with a broken heart and an emptiness inside. I packed mechanically, not thinking about what I was taking and what I was leaving behind. Folded my clothes into my suitcase, packed a few personal items, a picture of Mabel. For everything else, I had neither energy nor desire. An hour later, as promised, Leroy hailed a cab. He stood in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest, watching me carry out my meager belongings. "Where are you going?" he asked when I was already at the door. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "A motel, I guess. Just for a while." "I see," he nodded as if it were casual small talk. "Well, good luck. Not a word of regret, not a hint of gratitude. Just good luck, like a casual acquaintance." I silently walked out, closing the door behind me. In the elevator, going down to the first floor, I tried to comprehend what had just happened. My own son, flesh of my flesh, kicked me out of the house after I gave him everything I had. A cab was waiting at the entrance. The driver helped me load my things. "Where are we going?" he asked. I said the first thing that came to mind, the name of a motel I'd seen on the way to the bank. Inexpensive but clean, as far as I could tell from the outside. All the way there, I stared out the window at the streets of Brookings whizzing by, the city where I'd lived all my life and was now homeless. It felt unreal, like it was all a bad dream I was about to wake up from. The motel was exactly what I expected, a faceless building with rows of identical doors and a neon sign that was partially burned out. I rented a room for the week, paying cash, and brought my suitcase inside. The room was small and dull, a bed, a nightstand, a table, a chair, and a TV on the wall. The bathroom was the size of a closet, with mold stains in the corners. But it was a place where I could sleep for the night and gather my thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the springs of the mattress sagging under my weight. And for the first time all day, I let myself feel the pain in its fullness. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal. It was the realization that for the past 15 years, I'd been living an illusion, a hope that one day Leroy and I would be a family again. Now that illusion was gone for good, and I was alone in a cheap motel with a broken heart and an emptiness inside that nothing seemed to fill. I hardly slept that night. The old motel mattress pressed painfully on my back, and the neighboring room was filled with loud voices and music until deep into the night. But that wasn't the main reason for the insomnia. The events of the last few days replayed over and over in my head like a jammed tape. Leroy's words, cold and cruel, cut the heart sharper than a knife. "Well, you've done a great favor for me. Now get out." How could he? How could my own son do such a thing? I got up at first light, feeling defeated and devastated. Took a shower, changed into a clean shirt and pants, simple acts that gave some sense of normalcy to this nightmare my life had become. I had breakfast at the little cafe across the street from the motel, just coffee and toast. Nothing else. And then, without knowing why, I got into a cab and gave Leroy's apartment address. Maybe it was stupid. What did I hope to see or hear? An apology? From Leroy? After everything that had happened? But some part of me, the fatherly part of me that would never die no matter what, pulled me there like a magnet. I had to see him again, to try to understand him. The cab dropped me off a block away from Leroy's house. I didn't want to pull right up to the driveway. Something told me it was better to stay back. I found a bench in the small square across the street where I could see the entrance to his house. I sat down, pulling my cap deeper over my forehead, feeling as ridiculous as a character in a cheap spy novel. The morning was cool but sunny. People were rushing to work, walking their dogs, taking their kids to school. Just a normal day in Brookings. For everyone but me. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I continued to sit, watching the driveway of Leroy's house. Time stretched slowly. An hour and a half. I was beginning to think I'd come for nothing when I noticed Leroy coming out of the driveway. Even from a distance, I could see that he looked cheerful and satisfied with life. He was dressed neatly, his hair neatly styled, not a trace of the anxiety and fear he'd shown when he'd come to me to ask for help. He got into his car, parked in the driveway, and drove away. I continued to sit there not knowing what to do next. Part of me wanted to follow him, to follow where he was going, but I realized the absurdity of that idea. Besides, my attention was drawn to another car slowly pulling into the yard. It was a black sedan with government license plates. Such cars were rare in Brookings, and I immediately tensed up. The sedan pulled up in front of Leroy's house, and 3 men in smart suits got out. They looked resolute and official even from a distance. It was clear that they were government officials of some kind. The 3 men entered the entryway. I sat there without moving, wondering what was going on. 10 minutes later, they came out, got back into the car, and drove away. I was already thinking they had the wrong address or hadn't caught the man they were looking for when the sedan returned. This time, another car came with it, just as black and official looking. The same 3 men got out of the first sedan, and 2 more men got out of the second sedan, one of whom was carrying a folder of some kind. They went back into the entryway. I didn't know what was going on, but I sensed it had something to do with Leroy. My intuition told me to wait. About half an hour later, I saw Leroy's car pull up to the house. He jumped out of it, not caring to park properly, and walked briskly toward the driveway. I could tell from his movements that he was nervous or in a hurry. I sat there, unable to take my eyes off the driveway, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Something was happening, something important, and I had to find out what it was. The decision came suddenly. I got up and walked across the street to Leroy's house, not to the driveway, but to the side of the building where the large panoramic windows of his 7th-floor apartment were. I wasn't going up. I just wanted to be closer, maybe hear something, see something. I found a spot that gave me a good view of the entryway, but kept me out of sight, between 2 parked vans. From there, I saw 3 men in suits come out of the entryway about 20 minutes later, and Leroy with them. He wasn't handcuffed, but it was clear from the look of him that he wasn't just escorting them. He was being led like a detainee. Leroy looked pale and shaken. His self-confidence was gone, his shoulders slumped, his eyes running around. I instinctively retreated deeper into the shadows between the cars. But something made me look out again, and then our eyes met. Even from a distance, I saw his pupils dilate with surprise, his face show understanding, and then fury. He said something to the man beside him, jerking toward me, but he shook his head and took him firmly by the elbow. One of the men, tall and thin, with a neatly trimmed beard, separated from the group and walked toward me. I froze in place, not knowing whether to run or stay. "Mr. Hicks?" he asked, stepping closer. Dash Clint Hicks. I nodded, unable to utter a word. "I'm Agent Ray Prescott, Federal Internal Revenue Service." He showed his ID. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure," I answered, feeling my throat go dry. "We just arrested your son, Leroy Hicks, on charges of tax evasion for illegal gambling income," Agent Prescott said calmly. "Advenir, we have a warrant for his arrest and a search of his apartment." I nodded silently, not knowing what to say. "He claims you're somehow connected to our investigation," Prescott continued, watching my reaction carefully. "Is that true?" I swallowed, feeling my heart pounding in my throat. "Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about." Prescott smiled slightly, as if he'd expected that answer. "2 weeks ago, we received an anonymous package of documents," he said. "It contained detailed information about your son's illegal gambling activities, including dates, amounts won, locations of the games, and names of other participants. Very detailed information, Mr. Hicks. The kind of information only someone very close to the situation could provide." I remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. "We ran a check," Prescott continued. "The information was confirmed. Your son has won substantial sums at Brookings underground casinos over the past 2 years and hasn't declared a dime. That's a serious federal offense." "I understand," I said quietly. "You do realize that if you are somehow involved in providing this information, you may have to testify?" I nodded, looking over Prescott's shoulder at Leroy, who was now being ushered into a black sedan. Even from a distance, I could see that he was looking straight at me, and there was pure, undiluted hatred in his gaze. "I'll do whatever it takes," I said. "Dash good." Prescott handed me a business card. "Call me tomorrow. We'll set up a time for a formal announcement." He turned to leave, but then he stopped and looked at me curiously. "May I ask if it was really you? Why? Why did you turn in your own son?" I stared at the agent for a long moment, searching for words. "Sometimes," I finally said, "the harshest love is to let a man face the consequences of his actions." Prescott nodded, as if understanding more than I had said. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Hicks." He left, and I was left standing between the cars, feeling strangely numb. I watched the black sedans take my son away, probably for years to come, and I felt nothing. No gloating, no regret, not even relief. Just a dull, dull ache somewhere deep inside. I slowly wandered back to the square, sat down on the same bench, and looked for a long time at the house where yesterday I lived with my son, hoping for a new beginning. Now those hopes were finally buried. I knew that Leroy would never forgive me, and I probably could never forgive him either. But the truth was that I felt no satisfaction in his arrest. It wasn't revenge, though Leroy no doubt saw it that way. It was, what? Justice? Necessity? Or just a last, desperate act by a father who no longer knew how to get through to his son? I remembered how it all began. 2 weeks ago, when Leroy had come to me with the story of his debts, I had immediately realized something was wrong. His story sounded too smooth, too well rehearsed. And while I pondered how to help him, a part of me, the part of me that was always wary, even when my heart wanted to believe, began checking the facts. I knew the names of the creditors on the list Leroy had given me, knew the amounts and dates. And while he thought I was busy selling the house and withdrawing my retirement savings, I quietly made inquiries, visited a few places, talked to a few people, and I learned a lot more than I expected. Leroy wasn't a victim, as he tried to portray. He was a gambler, and a pretty successful one. Over the past 2 years, he had won substantial sums of money, over $300,000. Of course, he had lost too, like all players. But on the whole, he stayed in the plus side. The real reason for his sudden debts was not bad luck in the game, but cocaine addiction, which he had developed in recent months. He spent his winnings on expensive parties, women, and drugs. And when the money ran out, he started borrowing from the same people he was playing with, people who were not used to forgiving debts. When I learned the truth, I realized that simply paying his debts was not the solution. Leroy needed help, serious help, but I knew he would never accept it willingly. He had to hit rock bottom first before he could begin to climb back up. And then, in the quiet desperation of a father who sees his son destroying himself, I gathered all the documents, all the evidence I could find, and sent them anonymously to the IRS. I knew it could mean jail time for Leroy, but I also knew that without outside intervention, he would continue on his path to self-destruction. I hoped that the threat of arrest would make him think, change course. Maybe after paying off his debts, he'd get a second chance, be able to start a new life. I didn't expect the IRS to react so quickly. I didn't expect it to happen like this. And then something happened that I never saw coming. Leroy kicked me out, used and discarded me like a piece of junk. And that's when I realized that all my hopes were in vain. My son had no intention of changing. He didn't appreciate my sacrifice, didn't see it as an act of love. For him, it was just a transaction, a way to solve the problem and get on with his life. And that's when I stopped questioning my decision to turn him into the IRS. Not out of revenge, no, I never wanted revenge on my only child, but out of an understanding that sometimes the hardest act of love is letting the person you love face the consequences of their actions. I sat on the bench as the sun began to slip towards sunset. My thoughts were swirling around in my head, but slowly came to order. I knew I had some difficult days ahead of me. Testimony in court, perhaps a confrontation with Leroy, condemnation from the few friends I had left in Brookings when they found out I'd turned my own son into the authorities. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange calm. It was as if the enormous weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders for 15 years was finally beginning to lift. I had done everything I could for my son. There was nothing more I could give him. I stood up and slowly walked to the bus stop. I needed to get back to the motel, to ponder my next steps. Maybe Brookings wouldn't be my home anymore. Maybe it was time for a fresh start, somewhere where no one knew me. On my way out, I passed a small park where children were playing. Young parents were watching them, laughing and chatting with each other. One young couple in particular caught my eye. The father was tossing a little boy in the air, and the boy was laughing with joy. The mother watched them with a gentle smile. I remembered doing the same with Leroy when he was 3 or 4. How he had laughed, how he had asked, "One more time, Daddy, one more time." How Mabel worried I'd throw him too high. Everything seemed so simple then. We were a happy family, with ordinary dreams and plans for the future. When did it all go wrong? At what point did we lose each other? Maybe it started before Mabel died. Maybe I was always too busy working, too tired to really be there for my son. Maybe Mabel is right, and Leroy and I are too much alike. Both stubborn, both hiding our feelings. But it's too late for that kind of thinking now. What's done is done. And my son, the man I once tossed into the air to joyous laughter, was now probably sitting in a holding cell, cursing my name. And I walked the streets of the city that was no longer my home, a lonely old man with no family, no home, almost no money, but strangely freer than I had been in years. When I reached the motel, I felt fatigue spilling over my entire body. Age reminded me of itself with pain in my knees and back, shortness of breath after a long walk. I sank down on the bed without turning on the light and closed my eyes. Tomorrow I'd have to call Agent Prescott, give a statement. We'd have to decide what to do next, where to go. But tonight I just wanted to rest, to sink into a dreamless sleep, where there was no pain of betrayal, no bitterness of loss, no weight of decisions made. In the semi-darkness of the room, I thought I saw the silhouette of Mabel sitting in a chair by the window. "You did what you had to do, Clint," her voice seemed to whisper. "Now let go." And I let go, closed my eyes and let fatigue carry me to sleep, knowing that when I woke up in the morning, a new chapter of my life would begin. A chapter without Leroy, without illusions, perhaps without Brookings, but with a new freedom and maybe a new understanding of what it means to truly love. When I woke up the next morning in the featureless motel room, I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling and remembering the events of the past 2 weeks. My thoughts flowed slowly, like thick syrup, taking me back to the moment when it all began. The night Leroy showed up on my doorstep with a story of debt and threats. I remembered my feelings at that moment, a mixture of worry, love, and hope. Hope that this trouble, oddly enough, might be a chance to rebuild a relationship with my son. But there was something else too, something I didn't fully realize at the time. A shadow of doubt, a small alarm bell at the edge of consciousness. That feeling intensified when Leroy gave me a list of his creditors. The list was too neat, too detailed for a man who was supposedly on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Names, amounts, dates, all organized with a methodicality completely uncharacteristic of my son, as I knew him. And then, while I was in the process of selling the house and sorting out the formalities, a part of me began to investigate. Not out of distrust of Leroy, no. Rather out of a desire to better understand the situation he was in so I could help him more effectively. I started with the simplest of things, an internet search. Brookings underground casinos, illegal gambling, debts to bookmakers were phrases I never thought I would type into a search box. Information was scarce, which is not surprising. This sort of thing doesn't advertise in the public domain. But I did find a few forums where anonymously discussed places to play high-stakes cards in our town. They mentioned Fred's Bar on Clare Street, the back room of Eight's Billiards, and some warehouse in an industrial zone. I wrote down the addresses, not quite sure what I was going to do with them. The decision came suddenly. That night, when Leroy didn't show up to help with the packing again, I put on my most unassuming sweater, a cap I almost never wore, and drove to Fred's Bar. It was a strange place, dark, smoky, with a clientele that was clearly not middle-class Brookings. I felt incredibly out of place, a 74-year-old retired chemical engineer among these people with hard faces and wary looks. I sat down at the counter and ordered a whiskey, a drink I'd hardly had since I'd passed 60. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a thick gray beard, gave me an appraising look. "Is this your first time here?" he asked, placing a glass in front of me. I nodded, trying to look natural. I was driving by, so I thought I'd stop by. quote, the bartender said without much interest. "If you're looking for a regular bar, there's the Old Oak down the street. It's decent." It was a hint that I didn't belong here, but I wasn't going to leave so easily. "Actually," I said, lowering my voice, "this place was recommended to me as special. They said there was more to it than just drinking." The bartender tensed, his gaze sharpening. "Who recommended it?" I took a sip of whiskey, feeling it burn my throat, and mentally went over the names on Leroy's list. "A guy named Tate," I said, remembering one of them. "Noah Tate." The bartender's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told me the name was familiar. "I don't know him," he said dryly. "And I don't know what kind of entertainment you're talking about. We're just a regular bar." I nodded, took another sip, and decided to change tactics. "My son plays here," I said bluntly. "Leroy Hicks. He's in trouble. I want to help him." The bartender looked at me for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Look, mister, I don't know who your son is or what kind of trouble he's in, but if you're a cop or from the IRS, you better leave now, while the going's good." "I'm not a cop," I said quickly, "and I'm not from the IRS. I'm just a father who's worried about his son." The bartender studied me for a few long seconds, then nodded faintly. "If your son really plays here, he knows the rules. And he knows there's only one way to solve problems: with money. I can't help you with anything else." With those words, he walked to the other end of the bar, signaling that the conversation was over. I finished my whiskey and left, feeling that I had learned nothing new but somehow confirmed my suspicions. The next day I went to the Eight's billiard room. I had better luck there. It was almost empty in the middle of the afternoon, with only a few people playing on the far tables. I took the cue and balls, pretending that I wanted to play a game alone. The old woman behind the cash register, thin, with a wrinkled face and bright lipstick, watched me with mild interest. "How long has it been since you've played?" she asked me when I failed to hit the ball for the third time. I smiled embarrassedly. "A long time. To be honest, I'm not here so much for pool." She raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, waiting for me to continue. "I'm looking for my son," I said, lowering my voice. Leroy Hicks. I'm told he comes here. For games other than pool. The woman looked around, made sure no one was listening, and came closer. Tall, dark hair, always well-dressed, she asked. I nodded, feeling my heart beat faster. Yeah, that's him. I know him, she nodded. He's around a lot on Friday nights. He goes in the back room. Is he okay? I asked. I heard he's in trouble. The woman shrugged her shoulders. I don't know about problems, but he's playing well, winning a lot, especially in the last few months. That contradicted what Leroy had told me. He claimed he was losing huge sums of money, that he was in debt. But this woman said he was winning. Are you sure? I persisted. It seemed to me that he was losing big. She looked away again, then leaned in even closer. Look, I don't know what he told you, but the last time I saw him, he won over $20,000 in one evening, and not for the first time. Guys on Noah's payroll. Dash Noah Tate? I clarified, remembering the name on the list. Yeah, she nodded. Tate runs most of the gambling business in town. If your son is playing at his place and winning, then he's really good. I thanked her, left a generous tip, and left, feeling the uneasiness growing inside. Leroy's story was starting to fall apart. Over the next few days, while negotiations were underway to sell the house, I continued my investigation. I visited a few more places, talked to different people. Some refused to talk to me. Others were more open, especially when I introduced myself as Leroy's father and showed the picture in my wallet. Gradually, a picture emerged that was quite different from the one my son had described to me. Leroy was not a victim of failure or deception. He was a successful gambler, well known in certain Brookings circles. Over the past 2 years, he had won substantial sums of money. Different people gave different figures, but they were all in excess of $200,000. But if he was winning, why did he need my money? Why was he talking about debts and threats? I got the answer at the last place I visited, a small bar on the edge of town where mostly working men gathered after their shifts. The bartender, a young guy with tattoos on his arms, recognized Leroy from the photo instantly. Oh, that one, he said with slight disdain. Yeah, I know him. Big gambler. Big fan of powder. Powder? I asked, not immediately understanding. Cocaine, the bartender explained, looking at me like a naive child. Your son's been getting hooked. First only on weekends, then more often. Now they say almost every day it's expensive, you know. Even for someone who's good at cards. That was the last piece of the puzzle. Leroy didn't lose at cards. He lost his winnings and more, to his addiction. And now he came to me with a story about debts to gambling lords to get the money. I came home that night and sat in the darkness of the living room for a long time, pondering everything I had learned. My son had lied to me, used me. But worst of all, he was destroying himself, and I saw no way to stop him. If I just gave him money, he'd pay his debts, yes. But then what? Go back to gambling, back to drugs, back into debt? Or would the consequences be worse this time? I knew I had to do something to make him stop, to think, something to stop him from continuing down the path of self-destruction. The idea didn't come right away. At first I thought about talking to him directly, telling him I knew the truth, but an inner voice told me he'd just lie again, find new excuses. 15 years of estrangement had taught me one thing. Leroy always found a way to avoid responsibility. I thought about going to the police, telling them about the underground casinos, but that could jeopardize not only Leroy, but many other people, including those who had helped me with my investigation. That's when I thought of the IRS. Tax evasion is a serious crime, but not one that gets you locked up for years, especially if the perpetrator cooperates with the investigation and makes restitution. This could be exactly the lesson Leroy needed. Serious enough to make him think, but not so serious as to ruin his life completely. Besides, I was pretty sure Leroy didn't pay taxes on his winnings. Clandestine casinos don't issue official receipts, and the amounts my informants were talking about were large enough to interest the tax authorities. The decision wasn't easy for me. For days I struggled with myself, with the contradictory feelings that were tearing me up inside. On the one hand, fatherly love, the desire to protect my son at any cost. On the other, the realization that true protection sometimes means letting a man face the consequences of his actions. I remembered Leroy as a little boy, his laughter, his trusting gaze. I remembered Mabel, her last days, her plea to take care of her son. Was I letting her down by making this decision? But then I remembered other things, how Leroy had changed over the years, how the wall between us had grown, how his gaze had grown colder and his words harsher. I remembered his accusations at Mabel's funeral, his years of estrangement, his lies now. And I realized that the real betrayal would not be in reporting his illegal activities to the authorities, but in allowing him to continue on his path of self-destruction by doing nothing. Determined, I drafted an anonymous letter to the IRS. I included everything I recognized: names, dates, amounts, places. I included some photos I'd taken of the pool hall where Leroy met with people connected to the gambling business. Added information about his bank accounts that I found in his files while he was asleep. Large deposits that didn't match his official bookmaker's salary. I didn't sign the letter, didn't put my name or relationship to Leroy on it. I simply mailed the packet of documents to the IRS regional office, feeling a strange mixture of determination and guilt. And then I continued with what I had originally planned: selling the house, withdrawing my savings, preparing to help my son. I was still going to give him money to pay off his debts. I was still hoping to rebuild our relationship. But now I also had a backup plan, a plan that would work if Leroy continued on his destructive path. Strangely, having made that decision, I felt some relief. It was as if some of the weight I'd been carrying all these years had lessened a little. I had done my best as a father. Now all that was left to do was wait and see. As Leroy and I drove to meet with his creditors to give the first installment of the money, I watched their interaction carefully. Noah Tate, a tall man with cold eyes, looked at Leroy with a slight contempt that confirmed my suspicions. This was not the relationship of victim and extortionist. It was the relationship of a man who had defaulted and one who had come to collect a debt. "You're a good father, Mr. Hicks," Tate said to me then. "It's a shame your son doesn't appreciate it." I realized in that moment that Tate saw the situation more clearly than I did. He could see that Leroy was using me, that everything he'd said about the new beginning was a lie. But I still didn't want to believe it completely. Part of me still hoped that once the debts were paid off, something would change. Moving in with Leroy was supposed to be the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. I had hoped that living together would help us overcome the barriers built up over 15 years. But instead, I saw his real life. An expensive apartment he couldn't afford on his official salary, occasional women, night outs, and most importantly, a complete lack of interest in rebuilding a relationship with me. Every day spent in his apartment confirmed the correctness of my decision to go to the IRS. Leroy wasn't going to change. He just wanted to get the money and get on with his life as before. And yet, when I overheard him on the phone calling me an old man and laughing at the idea of a new life together, the pain was unbearable. It's one thing to suspect you're being used, and quite another to hear that confirmation from your own son's mouth. It was then that I realized my hopes had been naive. Leroy had long since ceased to be the boy I knew. He had become a man for whom money and his own pleasures were more important than anything else, more important than relationships, more important than family, more important than his own father, who had sacrificed everything for him. And when, after receiving the last of the money, he kicked me out of the apartment with the cruel words, "Well, you've done a big favor for me now. Get out," I felt no surprise, only pain and final confirmation that my son was lost to me forever. Sitting in the motel that night, I thought about the letter sent to the IRS, about what it could mean for Leroy: jail time, fines, loss of reputation. Part of me wanted to call it off, to protect my son from the consequences, even after all he'd done. But the other part, the more rational, less emotional part, realized that this might be Leroy's only chance. A chance to stop, to reflect, to change the course of his life. A chance I couldn't give him any other way. I felt no gloating or desire for revenge, only a deep, unending sadness at the realization that my relationship with my son had come to this point, and the hope, faint but still present, that maybe someday he would realize that I was acting out of love, not out of a desire to hurt. I didn't know how long it would be before the IRS responded to my letter. A week, a month, 6 months. Bureaucracy works slowly. I thought I'd have time to find a new place to live, get settled, maybe even leave Brookings if I wanted to. But that's not what fate had in store. The IRS responded with amazing speed just 2 weeks after I sent the letter. So there I stood, hidden between cars, watching my son being escorted out of the house by federal agents. The moment our eyes met and I saw the understanding and rage in his gaze, I felt a strange calm. It was as if the circle had closed, as if what was about to happen had finally happened. I knew that Leroy would never forgive me, knew that from this moment on, there wasn't just a wall of alienation between us, but a chasm that nothing could bridge. But I also knew that I had done everything I could. As a father, I was trying to protect him from himself the only way I had left. And if the price of that protection was his eternal hatred, then I was willing to pay it. Because true love sometimes means making hard choices, making hard decisions, even if it breaks your own heart. I watched the black sedan drive Leroy away and thought about Mabel, about what she would say now. Would she approve of my actions? Or would she think I had betrayed her trust by failing to protect our son? I'll never know the answer to that question. But I do know that Mabel always believed in truth and responsibility. She taught Leroy that every action has consequences and no one should avoid them, even if it hurts. And I believe that somewhere in some form, she understands why I did what I did. Understands and maybe forgives me for not being able to find another way. It's been 3 months since the day I watched my son being taken away by IRS agents. 3 months of a new life that began with a night in a cheap motel and led me here, to Sun Valley, a senior home on the outskirts of Brookings. The irony didn't escape me. I was, after all, in the very place Leroy had wanted to send me to on our last day together. The only difference was that it was my own choice, made after much deliberation. After Leroy's arrest, I spent a week in a motel, thinking about my next steps. I had a little money left, what I had set aside before selling the house, and a small amount that had been returned by the IRS agents who had seized the rest of Leroy's funds as illegally obtained. It wasn't enough to buy a new house, but it was enough to live comfortably in Sun Valley for a few years. I visited several similar establishments in the area before choosing this one. Sun Valley was different from my ideas of a nursing home. It was a complex of small detached cottages surrounded by manicured gardens, with a communal dining room, library, medical center, and even a swimming pool. It housed mostly elderly people who were able to care for themselves, but valued the company of peers and access to medical care when needed. My cottage was small but cozy, a bedroom, living room, kitchenette, and a tiny terrace where I had set up a mini potted garden. I'd brought the few things I'd kept after the house was sold: Mabel's rocking chair, a bookcase, a few photographs, my father's oak chest. I put Leroy's pictures in a drawer. I couldn't look at them every day, but I didn't dare throw them away. Mornings at Sun Valley started early. I woke up with the first rays of the sun, a habit developed over the years of working at the factory. I brewed myself a cup of coffee, went out on the terrace and watched the world around me wake up. Other inhabitants of the house were also early birds. Some were walking small dogs. Some, like me, were just enjoying the morning coolness. That morning, exactly 3 months after Leroy's arrest, I sat on my terrace with a cup of coffee and a fresh newspaper. The Brookings Chronicle rarely spoiled its readers with breaking news, but today's front page headline read, "Local bookie faces up to 15 years in prison for financial fraud." I knew who the article was about without even reading further. Still, I forced myself to read the entire text. Leroy Hicks, a 37-year-old Brookings resident, arrested 3 months ago on tax evasion charges, now faces a much more serious punishment. An investigation into his financial activities revealed evidence of money laundering and securities fraud. According to investigators, Hicks used illegally obtained gambling profits to invest in fictitious companies created by himself and his accomplices. These companies were allegedly engaged in software development, but in fact did not conduct any activity and served only as a cover for the legalization of illegal proceeds. In addition, Hicks is accused of fraudulently raising funds from private investors for non-existent projects. The amount of damage caused to investors is estimated at more than $1 million. If all charges are proven in court, Hicks faces up to 15 years in prison and fines many times the amount of the stolen funds. I reread the article several times, trying to comprehend the magnitude of Leroy's crimes. $1 million, fictitious companies, money laundering. This isn't just tax evasion and gambling anymore. It's a well-organized criminal scheme. What has my son become? How could a man who grew up in our home, with our values, turn into such a fraud? What did I miss? What did I do wrong? What allowed this to happen? These questions have plagued me for years, but today, reading the article, I felt something like relief for the first time. Not gloating, no. Rather, a sense that justice exists, that the universe somehow balances good and evil. I didn't feel pleasure at the thought of my son spending perhaps 15 years in prison. It was pain, deep and dull, like an old wound. But along with that pain came the realization that now Leroy would not be able to hurt other people. That his victims, the very investors from whom he had swindled money, would at least get the moral satisfaction of knowing that the perpetrator had been punished. And there was another thought I was afraid to admit, even to myself. Maybe prison was exactly what Leroy needed, a place where he would be forced to stop, to reflect, perhaps to reevaluate his life, a place where he won't be able to run from the consequences of his actions like he's always done. Bad news, Clint? A voice behind me made me wince. I turned around and saw Pearl Dunham standing at the wicket gate of my terrace. Pearl was a short woman of 78, with short silver hair and surprisingly lively blue eyes. She lived in a cottage 2 houses down from me and often dropped in the mornings, ostensibly for a decent cup of coffee. She claimed I brewed the best in Sun Valley. Just a newspaper, I replied, folding the pages and setting them aside. Come on in. I just made coffee. Pearl smiled and walked onto the terrace, leaning on her graceful cane with its silver head. She didn't need the cane to get around. It was more of a fashion accessory than a necessity. Adds to my charm, she said with a sly smile. I poured her coffee and set the vase of cookies I'd baked yesterday on the table. Baking had become my new hobby here in Sun Valley, an activity I'd never done in Mabel's time, considering it a woman's work. Now I realized what I'd missed. There was something soothing, almost meditative, about mixing the dough, waiting for the oven to rise. The aroma of freshly baked bread or cookies. So, Pearl said, sipping her coffee, what was in the paper that made you look like you'd seen a ghost? I sighed. In the 3 months we'd known each other, Pearl had become not just a neighbor, but a close friend. She knew about Leroy, about his betrayal, about my role in his arrest. She didn't judge me, which was surprising and valuable. The article on Leroy, I said. He could face up to 15 years in prison. Turns out he wasn't just evading taxes. He was setting up shell companies, laundering money, defrauding investors. Pearl whistled quietly. That's pretty big, she said. How does that make you feel? I wondered. How did I feel? That's a hard question. I don't know, I answered honestly. Sad, of course. He's my son, after all. But also, relieved, I guess, that the truth had finally come out, that he won't be able to lie to people anymore. Pearl nodded, looking at me understandingly. You know, Clint, what you did took a lot of courage, she said. Not every parent is capable of such tough love. Tough love, I repeated, tasting the expression. Yeah, I guess that's an apt definition, though Leroy sees it differently, of course. It will take time, Pearl said. Maybe years. Maybe he'll never understand. But that doesn't make what you did any less right. I smiled at her gratefully. Pearl understood me as well as anyone, because she had her own story of family betrayal. Her only daughter had taken all her savings years ago, under the pretense of investing in a business, and then disappeared with the money, leaving her mother virtually destitute. Pearl had to start over at 65, finding a job as a librarian, saving every dollar, gradually regaining financial stability. Sometimes I think I could have done things differently, I said, looking into my cup. Maybe if I had been a more attentive father, if I had noticed the problems earlier. Stop it, Pearl said firmly. We've been over this. You can't be responsible for a grown man's choices. Leroy chose his own path. You did the best you could. I knew she was right. The rational part of me understood that. But my father's heart was still aching, still searching for ways to take the blame, to find an explanation that would soften reality. 15 years, I muttered. He'll be in his 50s when he gets out. If he gets the maximum sentence, Pearl pointed out, which is unlikely for a first serious offense. He'll probably get less and get out early on good behavior. Yeah, probably, I agreed. It's a long time anyway. Long enough to think about things, Pearl said, and maybe change. I nodded, though I wasn't sure Leroy was capable of real change. In the 15 years since Mabel's death, he'd only grown distant, colder, harder. Prison might have hardened him even more. What about you, Clint? Pearl asked, changing the subject. Are you happy with your life here, I wondered. Was I happy with it? 3 months ago, I'd lost the house I'd lived in most of my life. Lost the last illusion of being able to rebuild a relationship with my son. Ended up in a place I would have previously called a nursing home, with mild disdain. And yet, yes, I answered, surprised at my own sincerity. I think so. It's peaceful. I can do what I like, reading, baking, tending my plants. No one judges me. No one demands anything from me but courtesy and respect. And I smiled at her. There's good company here. Pearl laughed, a light, melodious laugh that always lifted my spirits. Oh yes, an old man like you should appreciate the attention of a beautiful young woman like me, she joked. We both laughed. Being 4 years apart hardly made her a young woman. But in Sun Valley, the age hierarchy was quite different than in the regular world. Do you know what today is? Pearl asked, finishing her coffee. A concert in the common room. A jazz quartet from the high school. I hear they're pretty good. Sounds interesting, I said. Shall we go together? Sure, she stood up, leaning on her cane. Pick me up at 3? I'll be right on time, I promised. Pearl left, and I stayed on the terrace, thinking about our conversation, about Leroy, about the newspaper article, about my new life here. In 3 months at Sun Valley, I'd found something I hadn't expected. A new community, new friends, a new rhythm of life. Here were people with different stories, different destinies, but with one common denominator. All of them experienced losses, disappointments, joys and sorrows of a long life. No one here was surprised by family dramas or betrayals. Many had experienced something similar. In addition to Pearl, I became friends with Harvey, a former jazz musician who now taught saxophone to children at the local school. With Eleanor, a former school teacher who organized a book club in Sun Valley. With Fred, a former military man who raised the flag on the common grounds every day and lowered it at sunset with solemn ceremony. These men didn't replace my family. Nothing could fill the void left by the loss of Mabel and the breakup with Leroy. But they gave me something I didn't expect to find at this age. New connections, new relationships, new community. In the evening, I stopped by to pick up Pearl as promised. She was wearing a simple but elegant dress of deep blue that emphasized the blue of her eyes. I couldn't help but admire her. At 78, she retained the dignity and beauty that comes only with age and experience. You look beautiful, I said sincerely. And you're a flatterer, she parried, but I could see that she was pleased. We went to the common room, where almost all the inhabitants of Sun Valley were already gathered. The young musicians from the high school were nervously tuning their instruments. They looked so young, so full of life and possibility, it made my heart ache. Leroy had once been like that too. A teenager with the whole world in front of him, with endless possibilities. What went wrong? That question will probably haunt me for the rest of my life. But tonight I decided to put it aside, if only for the duration of the concert. The music was surprisingly good for a high school band. They played classic jazz, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Thelonious Monk. Mabel loved jazz and we listened to it a lot at home, especially on weekend evenings. Leroy, on the other hand, never showed any interest in music other than that modern noise he called rock or hip-hop. After the concert, Pearl and I decided to take a walk around the Sun Valley grounds. The evening was warm, starry, with a light breeze bringing the scent of jasmine from the garden. What are you thinking about, Clint? Pearl asked as we walked down the rose-lined path. About the past, I answered honestly. About things that could have been different. About a future that wouldn't be. Pearl took my hand, a simple, friendly gesture, but there was so much warmth in it, so much understanding, that I felt my eyes fill with tears. You know what I've learned in my long life, she said, that sometimes you just have to let go. To let go of the past, to let go of the hurts, to let go of the regrets. Not to forget, no, we can't and shouldn't do that, but to let go of their power over our present. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Your son made his choice, Clint, she continued, many times over and over again. You can't change that. You can't fix him. You can only accept reality and live your life the best way you can. I know, I said quietly. Rationally, I know. But the heart doesn't always listen to reason. It'll get easier with time, Pearl promised. Not better, but easier. Trust me, I know. I believed her. If anyone knew the pain of family betrayal, it was Pearl, and how to go on living in spite of that pain. We reached the bench by the pond where we often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset. We sat next to each other, still holding hands. Two old people who found comfort in each other's company. Do you know what the strangest thing is? I said after a long silence. I don't feel gloating that Leroy went to prison. I don't feel like I've gotten back at him, although that's probably how he sees it. I just feel sadness and a strange sense of justice, like the world is finally back in balance. That's because you're a good man, Clint, Pearl said. Despite everything that happened, you're still a good man who only wanted the best for your son. I squeezed her hand in gratitude for those words. We sat in silence, watching the last rays of sunlight color the pond with golden and pink hues. Tomorrow would be a day without Leroy, without past illusions, but maybe with new possibilities that I hadn't yet learned to see. 3 months ago, I lost everything I thought mattered. My home, my savings, my last hope of rebuilding a relationship with my son. But here, sitting on the bench next to Pearl, watching the sunset at Sun Valley, I suddenly realized I had gained something new. Not a replacement for what was lost. Nothing could replace the family I once had. But a new chapter, a new opportunity, a new beginning. And maybe in the end, that was exactly what I'd needed all along. Not to cling to the past, but to let it go and open myself to the future, however unexpected it might be. Pearl was right. It will get easier with time. Not better, but easier, and that's enough. That should be enough.